Consciousness is that which everything that we see manifests from. So essentially, as I see it, consciousness, God, in quotes, because that's just a word, spirit, those three words are completely interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. Hello everyone, this is Mark here, of course. If you don't know me, my name's Mark and I talk about spiritual principles and spiritual ideas, and I share them on YouTube and on Facebook. And this particular video is on the subject of consciousness. Now, consciousness is probably the hardest thing I have ever had to talk about, because it's just something that is almost beyond words, and in fact is beyond words. And I don't want to get too esoterical with you too early in the video, but essentially I'm talking about something which is completely eludes science. Science has no idea what consciousness is. There's a reason for that I'll touch on later on. But the reason I wanted to talk about consciousness is because it's something I talk about all of the time on my videos and on my Facebook posts. But I tend not to define it. I tend not to explain what it is. And there's a reason for that. Is I'm really hoping that people get a sense for something. There's something there called consciousness. It's a mystery. And of course, on a Facebook post or on a video, I can't go off on a huge tangent to explain, when I use the word consciousness, what I mean. But this is that huge tangent, I guess, hopefully not too huge. But this video is designed, hopefully, if it goes well, to be a point of reference. So when I'm talking about consciousness, I can refer to this video. So, even as I begin to talk, I have no preparation. I have like 4 bullet points in front of me, which is something I never do. And it's because it's such a difficult subject to cover. And I think you can understand why. So, what is consciousness? Now, it's a strange thing because it's something that you are listening to me with, and it's something at which I am speaking to you with. But of course, coming from a spiritual point of view, I'm not talking about consciousness from the point of view of being awake. I'm not talking about consciousness from the point of view of being conscious of something. That's not where I'm coming from. I want to discuss the fundamental nature of consciousness. What is it? What do I mean by it? Because the depth to which this is understood will be the depth to which you can unravel the problems in your life. And that brings me to the most important point. Why even talk about consciousness? Why bother? Is it just an exercise in being clever with words? Is it an exercise in, exploration? Is it just fun? Well, it can be those things as well. But I truly believe that, spirituality or talking about spiritual matters only have any value if they're practical. So there's a practical application. Like, what is the point of me making this video about consciousness? There is a big point, and I will get to that. So bear with me. I'm doing my best here. So bear with me. Stick with this. I think you're going to find it really interesting. There's a real big point as to why consciousness is important. I'll give you the punchline now so you know what to expect. Then I'll unravel it. Essentially, consciousness is fundamental. Or foundational, or the consciousness is that which everything that we see manifests from. So essentially, as I see it, consciousness, God, in quotes, because that's just a word, spirit, those three words are completely interchangeable as far as I'm concerned. The problem with the word God is it's loaded with baggage. There's a lot of baggage connected to the word God. When you say God, people visualize a man in the sky and all this sort of stuff. So I don't want to use the word God. But when I'm using the word consciousness in reference to a consciousness behind everything, I mean God. When I use the word spirit, I mean consciousness and God and spirit. It's all the same thing as far as I'm concerned. And if you can see the truth of this, that it is all the same thing, then as you're reading the Bible or as you're looking at anything, and you have that interchangeable aspect to those three words, I believe it will unwrap a whole new paradigm and understanding of what is being explained. So, consciousness, what is it? There's an experiment that if you've listened to anyone in traditional spiritual circles, anyone who talks about stillness or being in the moment or presence, mindfulness, not anyone, but some people bring this up. There's something that we can use to define, in a sense, what consciousness is. In fact, the truth is it's the only thing we can actually be sure of. And you may have heard this before. If you ask yourself the question, and maybe do this after the video, do it later. Don't do it when you're in bed because you'll stay awake and won't be able to sleep. But do it in a quiet moment. Ask yourself this question. What is the only thing that you can be sure of? Now, the reason why, let me tell you, kind of throw in some ideas to bring forwards what I mean by that question. For example, you could make the case, you could argue the case that right now you are in a virtual reality existence, meaning that what you see, what you feel, what you experience is not necessarily real. You could have put on a virtual reality headset. You know what I mean by those virtual reality headsets, the headsets where it gives you a different vision and you can look around. If that didn't exist, this analogy, this metaphor would be extremely difficult. But just imagine that for a moment. Or you could maybe imagine a dream, for example. A dream would be another reality. There's only one thing that you can be sure of in all those circumstances, and that is that you are experiencing. Okay? You can argue that this is all a virtual reality system, and you can't prove either way. Technically, you can't prove either way. But the one thing that's for sure is whatever is happening, you are experiencing it. There's something about you that has the ability to experience, and I use, let's say, experience reality, but reality implies that that's absolute truth. But there's something that's true. You can experience a reality, let's put it that way, or your reality. What you see as reality, which could be completely skewed and wrong, that's irrelevant. The point is the only thing you can be sure of is that you are experiencing that. So you could have been drugged, for example, in your sleep, and then someone put a really sophisticated, advanced virtual reality face mask on you, and you could be experiencing that instead. And some movies have touched upon this idea. There was one with Bruce Willis where they did actually stay in their homes wearing a virtual reality system, and it was like a mechanical version of them that went out into the world. And I forget the name of the movie now. But anyway, the Matrix movie kind of touched on this. People being plugged into a matrix where they felt that this was reality to them. And then the main character was awakened from the matrix and shown the true reality of, where he had been plugged in electronically through electrodes in his brain, so on and so forth. If you've never seen The Matrix, it's probably because you thought it was some sci-fi stuff about hackers or whatever. I highly recommend you see it, but it's quite a powerful, it's quite an action movie. It was designed to appeal to the masses with the action and everything, but the spiritual aspect of it is incredible, incredibly profound. If you look at it spiritually, that movie, very profound. Anyway, coming back to the point. So the only thing we can be sure of is that we are experiencing, that we are conscious of what's happening. Now, okay, that's great. So that's consciousness. Now, some people say that consciousness, or most of the world, most of science, not some people, sorry, most people believe, the world believes, science certainly believes that consciousness is a result of the brain, meaning that the brain is primary. Okay, the brain is primary, and consciousness is a manifestation or an extension of the brain. Okay, now I can understand why that's a very persistent illusion. That's what I'm going to say. It's a very persistent illusion, because really it brings up a very, very difficult question for even science to answer. If consciousness is a result of the brain, and you take a purely materialistic view, which is matter is just essentially dead, but organized into systems to create a living body. We now have a living body, but it's still made up of minerals, water, things that are considered dead. They're considered in science that water doesn't have consciousness. Magnesium, copper, iron, all these things that we're made of don't have consciousness in and of themselves. What else are we made of? Proteins, amino acids, all these things are made up of dead, inanimate minerals and elements. Somehow they organize together and it gives birth to consciousness. Now you've got to ask the question, how does something dead give birth to consciousness? Okay, that's a really difficult question that I believe science will never answer. They can kind of come up with a theory, but I don't think science will ever answer this question until they consider that which they are not willing to consider at this moment in time. And that is that there is the possibility of a primary, originating consciousness that's at the foundation of all matter, all life, all energy, the universe. Of course, I'm talking about God, because coming from a spiritual point of view, this is what I talk about. Essentially, I'm talking about God, the nature of reality from a God-centered point of view. I really don't like the word God. Not because I don't like the word God, but just because I know it's so steeped in baggage. So, let's explore this. Why is this important? Once again, I'm really trying to get to the point. The reason why it's important is because we tend to be conceptually, we tend to live conceptually, okay? Most people tend to have this idea, as I say, that consciousness is a manifestation of the brain, and that consciousness is born out of the brain. Now, I believe that is fundamentally what the fall of man being talked about in the Bible is talking about. That the idea of your brain being primal, your brain essentially, in that model, your brain is your God. If consciousness is a result of your brain, then essentially your brain is God, okay? And then and even people who believe in God have to create a dualistic model to make that work, meaning that we're somehow a separate physical entity with a brain that gave birth to consciousness, and then using that consciousness given birth to by the brain, we somehow use that brain to believe in a God. But when we do that, we only have a brain-centered or a knowledge-centered concept of God. It's not possible to have an experience of God or have a knowing or that sort of deeper spiritual connection with God when we only manifest God as an idea or as a concept. And that's essentially what's happening with that mindset. So the mindset of the mind being the source is the fall of mankind. Okay, the Bible puts it in different language, but that's what it means, I guarantee you. And if you care to go read the Bible after this, with this, considering the paradigm I'm laying out to you, see if it fits. Okay, because it says that, in the beginning, humankind was in union with the originating spirit. It's called paradise. Then they fell to the idea, which was warned about. The originating spirit warned them and said, if you eat from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, which is the brain, by the way, if you eat from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, you shall be as gods through your knowing of good and evil. It says knowing good and evil. But if you're going to say you will be as gods, knowing good and evil, there's implied a through knowing good and evil, because it was through the eating of the knowledge of good and evil. Okay, so it's circular. It implies it in its. If you circle back with that scripture, it implies it. It's what it's essentially saying is, instead of knowing that you're part of the originating consciousness, instead of being seated, so to speak, in the place of paradise, where you have a knowing that you are an extension of the originating consciousness, and the brain takes over, essentially, and the brain says, no, the brain says, I am the source of consciousness, which is what the world believes, and science believes, and atheists, and even many, many spiritual people believe this. The brain takes over and says, no, I'm the source of consciousness. Therefore, that is the fall, because it is through the knowing of good and evil, using the mind as the source of consciousness. Therefore, the mind is primary in providing the knowledge of good and evil, and the mind is God through that process of providing the knowledge of good and evil to that person's consciousness, and they don't realize their consciousness is entangled in their mind when it shouldn't be. Okay, and I know this may sound contradictory. As I said at the beginning, it's a really difficult subject to talk about, and I don't know if this video is actually going to be any good. We'll see. I guess I'll watch it afterwards. But anyway, so let's talk about what consciousness is now. Let me explain how I see it, how I model consciousness. Now, I can't tell you where the original consciousness came from. I cannot tell you that. All I can say is I wholeheartedly believe that there has to exist an originating consciousness before anything else. Okay? And of course you can call this intelligent design, you can call it God, you can call it the spirit hovering over the waters like the Bible does. You can call it in the beginning, you can call it many things. But I believe that it requires consciousness, meaning something that knows. Something that knows. It requires consciousness to give birth to everything that you see around you. And the Bible kind of alludes to it. I use the Bible a lot because it's really my tradition from where I am in my part of the world. It's what I've been mostly familiar with. I haven't studied other religious traditions. So don't necessarily think I'm like aligned to that or anything. I just use the Bible. I think the Bible has some amazing stuff. And anyway, I don't know why I said that, but the point is that the Bible does allude to this. It says in the beginning, something like this. I'm paraphrasing. The Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, let there be light. And there was light. Now light, light to me is to me that's like the quantum field in a sense. It's like the energy field. It's like the primal matrix, the primal lattice, the primal structure upon which it's almost like the saying of it, the consciousness giving birth to it. The first thing was light, which is energy. Okay, Einstein said that energy is the primal, is the governing force of the atom. From that came the atom, from that became matter, and from that came the creation of living things. So the primary source of all this is consciousness. Now consciousness is what we were given. When it says that God made man, it also says in his image. Okay, now this was written by men. So it uses, a certain language. It's been translated by men and uses a certain language. So you've got to see deeper than the language. Mankind was created using dead matter, essentially. The Bible calls it from the earth, the clay. But then the life was breathed into man and made in his image. Now, if consciousness is primary, and I believe it is, consciousness is primary, then how can someone like us be made in God's image? What is it that's made in God's image about us? Well, it is the consciousness that's breathed into us. But we also were formed physically in such a way that we can experience consciousness, that we can observe ourselves, because we're self-aware as well as being conscious. And that's something that seems to be unique to humans. I'm not saying animals aren't conscious, but that's a difficult subject. I may come on to that if I can in a moment. There's a difference with us. Our brains were formed differently. And I believe our brains were formed differently so that in the physical, we have the ability to experience a spiritual principle, which is truth, which is a truth. And that is that I am, in a sense. I don't know how to say that. See, that's what we know. We know that we are. I am that I am is what one of the answers God gave to who he was. I am that I am. And we know that we are. I'm not saying we're God. What I'm saying is we have that Godness given to us. That's our in his imageness, I call it. How are we in God's image? Do you think God looks like this? That's not what it means. We're in his image because we have a consciousness, but we have a physical ability to be self-observant, to be self-aware. I am that I am. So what's the practical use for this? I'm going to talk about that in a little while. I'm going to talk about that from the point of view of addiction. Okay, because it's a great example. But I want to talk about, just look at my bullet point here, because you often get the argument when I say this, and I get it. If this is your thought, if you thought this, and this is your argument against me, I totally get it, because it's a very persistent illusion. And I don't mean that in an arrogant way. But when I posted something about this on Facebook, one person said, well, if you want to prove that consciousness comes from the brain, just take the brain out and see what happens to consciousness. Well, okay, fair enough. Okay, I get it. If you take the brain out, consciousness dies, so to speak. Or if you put someone under an anesthetic, right, to have an operation, it seems like consciousness is put out. If you go to sleep, it seems like your consciousness changes. See, I don't mean that when I say consciousness. what I mean by it, you see, that's confusing two things. Okay, so let me explain that. Let me get into the deeper sort of esoterical idea of that. And there's a great analogy, okay, and it's this. What I'm saying is consciousness is not sourced in the brain. The brain is not the source of consciousness. But consciousness is seated, essentially, in the brain. Okay? Consciousness is where the Spirit of God, essentially, how our in his imageness meets physical reality. Consciousness is the point at which they meet, essentially. A great metaphor is this. If you ever go to a movie theatre, or you go to a cinema, whatever you call it, just imagine this for a moment. Behind you, if you look behind you, there's usually a huge projector somewhere in a room, high up on the back wall, projecting light, okay, onto a cinema screen. Okay, now the projector is kind of relevant how that's working. The point of the metaphor is that something is traveling from the projector to the screen, and yet the room is dark. They lower the lights, the room's completely dark. Okay, and if you look up, you cannot see anything in the air. Okay, unless there's dust, you can see the light bouncing off some dust maybe. But if there was no dust, if it was pure air, you wouldn't see a thing in the air. And yet, you look at the screen in front of you, and there's an image on that screen. Not only is there an image on the screen, there's people moving around, there's audio coming from the sides. It looks like the movie is coming from the screen, right? Absolutely. You would be forgiven for completely believing, and I almost guarantee you a small baby or a child would totally believe this, that reality is coming from the screen. Okay? Reality is coming from the screen. That is what you would believe. And you could prove it. You could remove the back wall of the cinema. You could get rid of the back wall, get rid of the screen, and the image would disappear. And you could conclude that the screen was the source of the image. Okay, now this metaphor is, obviously I'm playing games with you. It's obvious. Okay, we know where the image, but my point is it works well as a metaphor because you can't see it coming through the air. You only see it manifest on the screen, and it looks like the screen is the source of the movie. And you could make the case and prove your point by removing the screen, the movie disappears. Okay, if you'd have to remove the back wall as well to make the movie disappear. But the point is, you could actually say, well, no, this is the result of the screen. This is the result of the screen by doing that. And that's what that argument is essentially saying. It's essentially saying, well, if you remove the brain, you remove consciousness, therefore consciousness is only coming from the brain. No. I believe the brain is just like the screen. Consciousness is seated in the brain. Consciousness does need, you see, in our current existence, you've got to appreciate this. We have been placed in a physical reality. For whatever reason, and I could get into all sorts of esoteric or spiritual conversations right now, but for whatever reason, we are placed in a physical reality. And our consciousness is the point at which we can say, I know I'm experiencing something here. I'm aware, I'm self-aware. Our consciousness, okay, happens in our brain. But the brain is not the source of the consciousness. The brain is where consciousness meets this reality. I call the brain the interface to reality for consciousness. Your brain is an interface between spirit and reality, essentially, using that word interchangeably, spirit and consciousness interchangeably, and God. See, I believe our consciousness is an extension of God's consciousness. Okay? Except we experience it as individuals, but it's entangled with God. Okay? Because it has to be. Why? because if what I'm proposing is true, and consciousness is foundational to all matter, light, energy, everything, and we're in his image, we're in God's image, then our consciousness has to be a facet of God. It's not separate. Yet we're experiencing life as an individual. The purpose for that, I don't really want to get deep into right now. It's not the point of this video, because I could go off for 20 minutes talking about that. But more to the point, that is paradise. That is the paradise state. That is the eternal state. From that point of view, realize this. If what I'm saying is true, that your consciousness is an extension of God's consciousness, and we're experiencing through this meat, I call it a meat suit. This is like a suit of meat. This is like a brain and everything for consciousness to sit in and interface and experience physical reality. Okay? That's what it is. So, you know, if someone is deaf, for example, or blind, are they still conscious? Absolutely. But they can't experience vision. Okay? They can't experience sound. That doesn't mean their consciousness is gone. That doesn't mean their consciousness is any less. It just means that their consciousness can't experience those things. Imagine someone who has no sense of touch, no sense of feeling, no sense of smell. You know, it's almost like that sounds awful, right? But the consciousness would still exist. Consciousness would still exist. Okay? And there are people who are born, I think, deaf and blind, yet they still experience. You know, there's people there. There's consciousness is still there. So how does this relate then? What is this all? What is the point of all of this? What is the point of this conversation? Like, why am I discussing this? I just truly believe that this understanding, this way of seeing the world, this understanding just brings clarity to everything. It brings clarity to existence. It brings clarity to, okay, our origin is not this body. It's just where our consciousness experiences physicality for whatever reason I don't want to get into. So let's get on to the practical. Okay. Let me recap briefly. So consciousness is manifest in this physical manifestation. Our ears, eyes, nose are really they're like sensors. They're like sensors, you know, to bring in information to a brain, visual information to the brain, audio to the brain. The brain really is what's processing all of this. In fact, if you want to get really deep, nothing we see is really as we see it. Other creatures see in different spectrums of light, for example. Other animals see in different spectrums of light. The world they see is very different from the world we see. Okay, but there's certain fundamental truths. You know, over there I have a sofa, and that if I go and sit on that, that's solid. I know it's going to be solid. If any other creature sits on it, it's going to be solid. Okay, that's because that matter is held together through the foundational consciousness. Okay. This other stuff is held together through the foundational consciousness, meaning God, the Spirit. So that stuff is there, but the way we experience all this is through information that forms in our mind. Okay? So, the illusion that our mind defines who we are, like we believe that this is who we are. Okay? Like this body is me. This face is me. This voice. This mind, this brain is me. And that gives birth to the idea that consciousness is a result of my brain. And it's very strong. Even a spiritual person is caught up in the idea that this is them. I am whoever. Hi, I'm Mark. Hi, I'm Peter. That's kind of how we move around in this world. Okay? And that's fine, and it's all very well being all, spiritual and saying that's not really you and all the rest of it. What's the practicalities? I think the great example of dealing with the practicalities of this comes into play in addiction. Okay? People who are addicted to things. If you suffer with addiction, that is really, now I'm just going to give one example, but there's a myriad of complexities. There's a myriad of different circumstances, different traumas, different ways in which people end up addicted. Childhood trauma, being put on medication that's addictive rather, stress, many, many things. There's a huge basket of complexities that lead to essentially what's known as addiction, meaning essentially that the person usually is what's essentially happening is they're self-medicating. So whatever's gone wrong in the mind, in the body, whatever's gone wrong is bringing a great feeling of anxiety and pain to that person. And whatever they're reaching to, which could be anything, I believe that anything can be addictive, and I don't believe anything's necessarily more addictive than anything else. Computer games, cell phones, pornography, eating. People who are overweight, they're eating more than they need to. Something's going on there. The hard drugs, meth, heroin, cocaine, whatever. Okay? They're all essentially the same process in the brain. Okay? Now, I'm not trying to diminish anyone's experience or diminish the results of one thing being more addictive than something else. What I'm trying to make the point of is that I think we can all agree that regardless of what it is, it's something that happens in the brain. Okay? So, why does that even matter? Why is that even an issue? Here's why. If I'm right, if I'm correct in my assertion that you are your consciousness, but you are not your body, brain, and feelings, if I'm correct, and I'm saying to you your consciousness is entangled in those things, but if that consciousness is separate, essentially separate, wouldn't it be amazing if you could somehow realize that? Because what's happening with addiction is that in a case of addiction, it really, really, really creates a strong sense and a strong illusion and a strong feeling that this is all you are. Because if you're having an extreme craving for something, if you're craving something, what's happening there is your mind will be making reasons to go and do it. You don't want to do whatever it is. You're trying to talk yourself out of it, but your brain is saying, well, just do it one last time and just try it. It's okay. You feel terrible. You'll feel better. You can stop next time. All this sort of thing. The mind starts to reason. The body's getting all these feelings and sensations surrounding it. There's cravings, there's anxiety, there's a feeling of like dread, and the body and the mind is really a salesperson, so to speak, really putting on a high pressure sales pitch for you to go and get the thing that medicates the body and mind to make it feel better. Now, the body is designed to put itself in a state of balance. So what's happened there really, as a side point, is that craving and all that stuff is a way that something that's unnatural is corrupted, hijacked something that's natural about the body. you eat, you're supposed to eat, you get a certain feeling of satisfaction from eating. You have joy, you have enjoyment, you have pleasure, you enjoy people's company. There's a certain feeling of pleasure and satisfaction and happiness and joy through eating and many things. People who are very traumatized and damaged don't have that. So the body tries to get it, but it tries to get it through a drug, essentially, or through pornography, or through whatever it is. Okay? So that is then, it's like this process has hijacked something natural. So the body really sells it to you. Now, what I'm suggesting in this whole thing is that there is a way, and it's possible, and I'm living proof of it because I've done it myself, and I can show people how to do this. I can teach it. Whether or not, I don't know how easily people will understand it, but I believe I can teach this. And I believe that it's very powerful, because what I'm suggesting is when something, I've done this myself, this is how I got over all my own problems, in a sense, essentially, which still sneak in every now and again, but I deal with them in the same way. The power over me is diminished so greatly, it's almost really not an issue. But I just wanted to throw that caveat in there, just that the body will still try and pull this trick on you many, many times, because it's like a pattern, it's like a memory, it's like a process that gets programmed. The body gets hijacked, as I already said. The endorphin system, the dopamine system gets hijacked. That's essentially what happens. So what I'm suggesting to you is there is a way, you see, and if you don't believe what I've said in this video, that it's possible, if you don't believe that if you believe your consciousness is a result of your brain, then you can't get, I don't know how you would ever get over your addiction, personally. I mean, there may be a way of doing it that I'm not aware of, but I don't know how you could, because the brain is telling you that it's the source of consciousness, meaning the brain is God. The brain is your God. Therefore, what the brain says, the brain gets. The only way you can win is if you argue against yourself using the very brain that has the problem in the first place. And that's essentially what happens in addiction. When people are trying to get over addiction, they try and argue with themselves. They try and think their way out of it. They try and talk themselves out of it. They try and reason themselves out of it. And what they're really doing is they're using the very brain that has the problem to fix the problem. And I guarantee, and the brain that wants the endorphin and the dopamine will win the argument. It will win the argument. This is why it's so hard. What I'm suggesting, and let me give you I'll just give it to you. I'll just fire it out and then I'll explain more. I'm suggesting there's a way that you can separate from your brain. There's a way that you can separate from your brain and your body. And it's a way that you can pull your consciousness back to a degree where you can literally look at your brain and look at your body and observe it craving. Craving. You can observe yourself craving for the substance or whatever it is. Just think this through for a moment. If I'm right, imagine it's almost like this. Let me use another metaphor. Okay, this may be difficult for someone who has an addiction. I don't know to relate to this metaphor, but someone who doesn't have an addiction can more easily relate to this metaphor. You can watch a person, like let's imagine there's another person in the room who is addicted to, say, heroin. Okay, and you can observe that person sitting there, and I'm talking about literally another person now, a different person altogether, a friend of yours. So you can observe them sitting there shaking, being all sort of nervous and twitchy and sort of and stressed and all sort of, all kind of, anxious, and you can observe them and you don't have that problem. So you're observing them, and even though you're seeing them suffer, you're not going to start doing what they do. There's no connection between you that you will get sucked into taking heroin with them. You're just observing this person suffering, and you may have great compassion for them, and you may want to help them, but your psyche and your consciousness isn't going to get sucked into their world where you take the heroin with them. That's kind of blindingly obvious. What I'm suggesting, though, is there's a way for a person to do that with themselves. There's a way for a person to literally be self-observing to such a degree that it's like watching another person. And that's the difficult part of this. That explaining that in words is difficult because it's beyond words. I've used this example before. It says, in the Bible, it says the carnal mind cannot see God. And it's kind of what I'm talking about here. The brain, see, if the brain tries to think about and understand how to separate from the brain, it's illogical. How can the brain think about and understand how to separate from itself? Do you see the problem? Do you see it? Because if the brain thinks about separating from itself, the brain is the one thinking about it. Therefore, the brain is entangled in itself, thinking about separating from itself. It's impossible. You can't think yourself out of thinking. You can't think your way out of thinking. Do you see the problem? Think about that. Think about that. You cannot think your way out of thinking because you're still thinking. Just like you can't put fire out with fire. But what you can do is step back from that thinking. Now do you see why it's important? Hopefully you see what I'm saying there, so you can see why it's important to understand what consciousness is. Essentially, again, consciousness, the originating consciousness, what we call God. The originating consciousness, that which we call God. The foundation to all matter, energy, life, matter, the universe. Universe means singly spoken verse. Universe. Spoken. Single spoken verse. That's a side point. The point is that some consciousness, God is consciousness. God is primary consciousness, brought all this into existence. He made us from matter. He made us special because we have cognitive ability. We have in the physical, we have the structure, the mental structure, the mental design, the mental construction to have the ability to be self-observing. Within that, consciousness meets matter. Consciousness, coming back to what I said at the beginning, is the point at which we know we're experiencing something. Consciousness is the point at which we know we're experiencing something. It's here. It's between my hands. This side is physical, that side is spirit. This point is the point at which we experience matter. Brain, eyes, ears, body is the interface between consciousness, also known as spirit, and physicality. If our body drops, we lose the ability to interface with matter. If our body dies, we lose the ability to interface with matter. Does that mean our consciousness vanishes? No, it doesn't. Unless you're a materialist and don't believe in this, then of course you believe that when your body drops, then consciousness drops. Of course you'd believe that. That's the atheist position. Okay? But an atheist believes that consciousness is a result of the brain. I'm saying consciousness meets physicality in this meat suit, this space suit, so to speak, this meat suit. this me suit. So if that's true, then consciousness is not sourced in the body. Therefore, I'm saying to you that it's possible to pull your consciousness out of the flesh far enough to observe the cravings of the mind, to observe the crazy cravings of the body, and in that place to see that that's the flesh craving that, that's the mind craving that, that's the mind trying to reason that it needs it. But you know essentially that it doesn't really need it. Okay, and I know that the physical, and see, this is where I'm trying not to get too deep into that. I know there's cases where the physical will shake, the body will really need it, the body will really crave it, and you may not be able to be strong enough. You may only be able to see the beginnings of the craving, and then you fall into the addiction. But you see, it gets stronger. If you practice this standing back, then over time, the body loses the power. Because the body wants you to believe that that's all that you are. And if that's all that you are, then you've got to satisfy all that you are. But if you can stand back from it and be the observer, then you can realize that, yes, your vehicle in which your consciousness travels within is damaged. It needs this badly. And you may even have to give it what it needs, essentially, for a while, and cut down the dose or whatever it is. But if you do that, do it from a place of objectivity. Now, it's not going to happen overnight. But I just want to get that idea across that it's possible. So, of course, I'm talking about consciousness. You know, this is a difficult video because it's like I've covered two major things. But I just can't talk about consciousness as an esoterical idea without giving a practical example. And I think the practical example starts to reveal what the point of consciousness is. Now, if you look at many spiritual traditions, it's all about this. Okay, I believe that Jesus was only talking about this. Okay, the language in which it's translated in is, my Father's within me. I only do what I see my Father doing. Why'd you call me good? Only the Father is good. All these things. Everything Jesus did was to tell us that there's an original consciousness. There's an original consciousness that Jesus didn't lose connection with and came to reconnect us to. Because essentially the blindness to this consciousness is found in the belief that this body and this mind is us. And we all, every single one of us, I don't care who you are, fall into that concept and that idea that this is who you are. And it's extremely persistent because we live in a physical world. I hope this video was good. I really do. Let me look at my notes. Okay, thanks for listening. And don't forget to like, subscribe and all that stuff. It all helps. Thank you. Bye.